Hello and welcome to another cover seminar. And for today's seminar, we're going to depart a little bit from the usual format. And instead of having a presentation, we're joined here by Maitrayee Deka, who's we're going to have a chat about her new book. So thanks for coming on, Maitrayee.
Thank you,
Uh,
Steve.
this would be the point where usually I would sort of like traditionally I would hold up a copy and say how great it is. But in keeping with the theme of your book, I didn't buy a copy, but acquired it through a dodgy, semi-legal PDF purveyor off the regular path. So I have no copy to hold up to you, but I think it's a really excellent book, and I'm really happy that we get to chat about it. Um, so what I thought we would ask as a sort of a starting point is so your overall project here is writing about sort of the sociality of bazaars and markets. And so I just wanted to ask like what brought you to the project? What brought you to writing about this, and yeah, how did you get there?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Stephen, for inviting me and also having read my book in the pirate form. So part of my job of writing the book kind of is explained by the practice. I started off this research way back in 2012. And when you asked me that question, it kind of got me thinking. I have always been fascinated by how technology gets embedded in everyday life, especially in a country like India, where I mean, this is more of a subjective view where I feel life goes on. And whenever another alien feature comes in, you're always thinking, would it adjust or would it be somehow be thrown away because everything seems so dense already. So I started off in my MPhil talking about Orkut. Now it's almost dead. I mean, it's a long time back in 2009. And I was really interested in looking at how social life gets somehow more not different, but aided by new technology. And then when I was doing that research, I found that video games had this even more dense layer of uh, imposing itself on the local life because of the gameplay and everything, characters which are so sophisticated, and then you have players in India or around the world playing that. So I wanted to do a cultural study of video games in India. So I was more interested in understanding the background of gamers, and what essentially drew them to play Gods of War or War of Warcraft, whatever that trending at that point. But when I started the research, I felt very almost immediately out of water because fish out of water because I was not a gamer myself. So they were very kind and tried to, but it was so patronizing, and I soon realized that even though ethnography can happen, from a distance, this was always going to be a distance which could be not very good in the end, because to understand everything what they were talking, I need to be at that level of gaming.
Hmm.
At that time, at one of the site, I had like IIT and technological institutions and other places, but one site was also the marketplaces. It was like a extended site to see where they were buying these games and how they were getting these games if they were playing on their private devices. And then I realized that this was actually a much more bounded field. So it was a very pragmatic decision, because everything else I was having so to face challenges, and here was a field which was in a way geographically limited. That was very helpful for me to say that I'm studying this marketplace or I'm studying that marketplace, as opposed to saying I'm studying video games of in the cultural landscape of India. So it started off that, and then of course it paid off, because I kind of was very intriguing from day one to hear what they were doing, and saying about their work, and also their relationship with new media technologies. Yeah.
That's super interesting, and I suspect that it was probably a good decision to shift the project in that way. And that my experience has been that particularly online gaming cultures can be one of the most toxic places in the world. So at the very least, your mental health has probably been helped a little bit by not being fully immersed in that world for many, many years. Um, It's also interesting that some of the things that come up in the book, I now make a bit more sense. Like one of the things I was really amused by is there's an image. It's like, is it like a wooden PlayStation or like a gaming console which has been sort of like retrofitted in a different housing unit than the regular one, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, it's like, so what happens, as you say, like the cultural universe of video gamers in India is as you know, selective and as closed as it would be in any other place, right? Because as you said, it gets a culture of its own. I was fortunate because maybe because I was a young woman and many of them were men, and this has been my story throughout my fieldwork in India in male spaces. They were a little bit more like, as I said, patronizing, like, you know, we'll teach you how to do it. But it kind of became a bit problematic because I was like, this is not how I feel. I have a direct relationship with the games. But on the other side, the marketplaces were also in a way so much more welcoming, because even though the gender aspect played along in kind of the differences, but what I found immediately accessible in the bazaars were the absence of hierarchy of
Mm.
the material culture of video games. And that touches upon what you were talking about. There was not an idea that video games should look like this and this is what it is. So there was not so much of this idea of mystification of technology that I immediately felt drawn to, because it was more like what was working, what you could do with it, how can you yield it to produce some kind of transactional relationship. And the wooden these kind of tinkering was constantly happening, because you were always thinking, what else can we do to make this video game, which is old and you know, also probably non-functional, to actually have a new lease of life. And everything kind of came into use in some way. So yeah.
Mm. One of the things that I really love about your book is that oftentimes, at least my experience, when you're reading about markets and market behavior, it can become very easy in a lot of literature to fall back into these almost kind of like mythological figures about like the rational economic consumer who is always maximizing and making decisions based upon profit and loss, and you know, and it has this certain abstract way of thinking and reasoning that is conceptually laid out. But when you actually look at how people actually act in markets in bazaars, their behavior is much more complicated. It involves all these layers of the culture of the market, decision making, background stuff that aren't in most economic discussions. And I think that's super interesting how you're sort of saying, well, look what else is happening here. Look at all the layering of all the cultural layering.
That was so important. In fact, like I'm always like thinking, how would a reader see the book? Because I feel like as a someone writing it, I definitely have two layers to it. You know, one is what I'm observing every day, and about that also I was very aware that it's funneled through me as a researcher of a, you know, through my gender or my class positioning, but still kind of trying to make sense of what I'm observing, and not to like glamorize it or try to manipulate it, at least from my point of view. So I was just trying to give it the empirical material to speak for itself as how I observe things. But in the back of my head, of course, I have this whole trajectory of you know, research and scholarship and collaboration and ideas that are there in academic spaces. And I was fortunate to write this book, you know, in 2010, when there is 100 years of solid at least, if not 100 years more, of debates along this line. And soon enough, I realized what started off as a frustration of this categorization was also, I realized, say so much about that time, you know, when we couldn't believe that one had to say that, okay, there's not an economic being which is just like profit maximizing. They are also social beings. That took such a long time, you know, with like Parsons, and of course we go back to Polanyi and things, but that took a really long time to actually say, actually economic beings are also social beings. And then it was so difficult for them to understand. So I felt that scholars had to come even harder, So someone like the formalist and substantivist school became so drawn out, because I feel the reasoning given from the other side were so strong. So you were saying, no, this is also there. And it's only in the new economic sociology and economic anthropology in recent years that they are now saying, okay, we have established we are social beings, market actors, but what does that sociality look like? And for my book, like at the theoretical level, it was very important to not make this simplistic assumption that just because someone is in economic activities doesn't make them altruistic, just because they're not altruistic doesn't make them dangerously unsustainable market actors. So this was a lot of to bring about the somehow the what works in these places is basically the ability to take on social character, but also having profit, which leads to the social reproduction of labor, which leads to these classes somehow proliferating in the margins of quote unquote capitalist neoliberal societies.
Yeah, so you have the idea that sort of market traders in the bazaar are not purely self-interested rational actors, but they're also not outside of capitalism or anti-capitalists. They're more like embedded in these layers of social and cultural norms, which are shaping how they interact. And one thing you talk about is they're in a position which is, I guess you'd say, shared marginality, and that they're marginal to the main economic flows, but you're trying to like navigate a position from the margins and find a sort of almost kind of a space of surviving or thriving in that marginality.
Absolutely. I mean, that's also something like, writing a book, you are always also aware that how do you use that space, right? Because you really have the liberty to draw a lot on almost to a speculative degree, because you have, as I said, this long history of scholarship to actually pull this a lot of these elements that you're observing in the marketplaces. Oh wow, this actually is something so critical and celebratory, because this is what essentially we have been trying to observe and attain in terms of a future society. But at the same time, when doing a field work, you realize the people there are not exactly experiencing any of it as the light bulb moment in your head, because these are marginal figures, as I say. And this is very important to note, not essentially always financially, because if you look at their monthly income, they actually some earn as close to £1,000 as well, which in India is a middle class and at some level a quite a adequate income to live well. And then you have someone who must be earning like £50 a month. So there is a bit of diversity in that. But the feeling of marginality, the feeling of anxiety of ever-changing marketplaces, some of it is directly targeted at them, for example, for piracy-related persecutions and raids, but also indirectly, the transformation of urban space from offline to online, etc. So their experience is of marginality. Some of it is more acute in terms of feeling the threat of their businesses going away, but a lot of it is also imagined for not being historically from that cultural and economic elite. So it's like everything that's been said as a model is also to be taken with a pinch of salt, that it is something that we have to excavate rather than felt by these people at this given moment of time when I'm in conversation with them.
One of the things that I'm curious about is the extent of, let's call them, informal, marginal, semi-legal zones. And the reason I ask is I spent a month in Delhi in about 2006, and I remember talking to a bunch of people there. And one thing that kept coming up was not just this in terms of markets, but also in terms of a lot of buildings were said to be not formally approved legally, right? There's a lot of informal planning in zones which there are things constructed, things happen, but are not officially authorized, and so thus they might be taken away because they're not approved. Is this a more general feature, not just in the markets, but sort of outside of them as well?
Yeah, I mean, I can go on and on about this. I think India as a post-colonial country is so important. I'm sure most post-colonial countries are equally interesting, but I know it closely because if you look at it historically as well, there's always been a lot of governance which has happened from the top down. Now you can ask the more philosophical question, is there a governance which is decentralized? Is it possible? But we are not going to go there. But it's always been historically, especially the city of Delhi has always been ruled by different power system, and the elite structure has been very good at formulating what works for them. So with some things are for the ordinary people, but most of the things have also been about somehow reproducing those kind of power hierarchies, whether it's in the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughal Empire, and also the colonial structure. But even if you forget about the rulers per se, the ordinary life is also so segmentary. So about the caste hierarchy, which is unique to India in some ways, and also quite bizarre in many ways, that we still have this kind of traditional ideas of segmenting population is pure and impure, and then you have religion, you have all other modern sense of ethnic and gender relations, etc. But what has happened is that a lot of the time officials are not able to take on this complexity of ordinary life. Now it begs the question, is it because they are lazy, they do not want to do the work, or is it because somehow the elite structures have flourished well throughout different regimes? And I think it's the latter, because in a way there has not been a concerted effort to really understand what ordinary life is all about. So it's always been imposition from above. And the post-colonial is the most interesting because the bazaars are in a way part of it. As I say, through the Delhi master plans of 1962, a lot of scholars like Ravi Sundaram, urban scholars, have looked at this in a very interesting fashion to see you are again zoning these places. You are mapping out, and with James Scott and all already Foucauldian perspective of seeing like a state, you kind of completely obliterate the chaos of everyday life, the whole texture of everyday life, and seeing it in this kind of blinkered fashion, and imposing. Now you will have a residential area, you actually have an industrial area, then you would have a workplace. Life is completely different, and on top of that you have mass scale migration happening of disenfranchised groups. So where are these groups going whose daily life is not figured in terms of this zoned modernist idea of workplace and home? So then you have this bazaars, which is, I think for me, is interesting, because it allows you not only the possibility to have live there in some ways, to have your life there, but also that you can earn a living. And they are also somehow very guerrilla style infrastructure. They're open, so the flow is there. You can enter from one side, you can disappear from another side, but you can also hide in the courtyards. You can also so it has this magical element of what has been taken away by modernist plan to be seen as exact categories of contemporary society, to being this invisible multitude which can get away and make do in this kind of informal infrastructure.
That James Scott reference is I think really useful, and that one way you could frame the book then would be, rather than talking about the bazaar in terms of techne, would be the bazaar in terms of Batiste, in terms of the informal knowledges, practices, and everyday practices, which maybe govern is the wrong word, but more or less that structure the bazaars, and I really like that, because one of the things you talk about is the idea about the urban commons of sociality, or the kinds of commons formed in everyday practices that people have in bazaars, that could be thought of as being collective practices, as commons, even though they probably aren't framed in aren't conframed in people's market traders probably aren't thinking of it in those terms, but you can understand them that way. So I guess what I want to ask about then is maybe a bit about yeah, I'm trying to think of a better way to say governance structure. So for instance, if you have shared norms of how a marketplace works, how a bazaar works, and this is similar to the ideas of how commons are run. Oftentimes there are informal arrangements, informal processes of commoning and keeping and governing commons that are important to keep in mind, so we don't end up in a sort of kind of tragedy of the commons type of situation. So there are norms which govern the bazaar or govern the commons just that they keep reproducing. Were you seeing things like that, or were there be times where someone, you'd have let's say a trader did something dodgy and people would be like, oh no, we don't do that here?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, like to circle back to what I was saying, when you are like thinking about what categories can you now talk about, how what you're observing in front of you, which is very distinct way of relationship with the material technology, right? That anything in a shop desk is now free for you to assemble, disassemble, scavenge different parts. So it is like steampunk in a way. So that's there. So then you are like thinking what objects are being used in this repair and tinkering. And most of the time these are objects which are in circulation. They are not going somewhere to buy essentially the nuts and bolts of the tinkering. They are looking for it which is in front of them, or borrowing, or kind of taking parts from abundant machines, or borrowing parts. And then you think this is a rhetoric we are talking about. This is a rhetoric of the commons where the idea of proprietorship is not there. It's people may take things and keep it with them for till the time the other person comes and say, hey, you have my screwdriver, or you have my a reballing machine is a different thing because it's an expensive one, but other things. So there's always this exchange happening within the marketplace. But also I think it creates these urban commons because they are at the opposite spectrum of the bourgeois consumption, right? These are not marketplaces that is the first taker of any products, but least of all media goods. These are marketplace which waits out somewhere the consumption cycle to run in middle class homes for them to have a lot of the residues. So the funneling of the waste and the commons and the abundant stolen, they all come together. But the key idea is nobody kind of have a privatized or a intimate relationship of ownership with them. But it's also, you're right in asking the question. I have never heard that this is mine, so or this practice shouldn't be there because we somehow it's morally wrong or something that should bother us. It's been the only social sanctions which has come about is through more the social behavior. So it's never been about so much about the practices of tinkering and innovation, which all the the what do you say now, the IP regime has been, right? It's always been about the creator's right and the obsession that the creator is not acknowledged, and how copyright and trademark, etc. Here, more than copying and borrowing, what becomes more problematic is how this actor is behaving. In a way, if he's behaving somehow in a disloyal fashion or in a morally dubious, that's kind of gets more, I would say, the eyeballs than. I mean, in fact, it's a non-issue in the marketplace to talk about tinkering in some ways as ownership or creativity in a broader sense.
I just want to ask about innovation, but I want to get there a different way. And I was curious, when you were doing the empirical research, you're out there talking to people, were there moments where you talked to people about, let's say, the possible divergences between ways you might want to frame practices and how they understood them themselves? But maybe that is, you talk, for instance, about how some of these market practices could be understood as critical or forming commons, but that for many people working in the market, in the bazaars, they're more but thinking about everyday survival, paying, getting food, paying bills, right? So they're saying, aha, I'm engaged in a practice of commoning resources, and like that's not their framing, right? Usually, I'm guessing. So I'm wondering, at any point did you start saying about, like, talk to people about how, let's say, the difference between how they're understanding their actions themselves and how other ways they could be understood? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Uh, it is difficult to pose those questions because, in one way, you don't want to interrupt their daily life and their way of doing and imagining things, because you feel already your encounter with these people. I always felt like this is a one-way relationship because I take so much out of what from their interaction and they don't get much from my interaction with them. On top of that, I did try to challenge, like, for instance, when they, lot of the point when they said like piracy or tinkering is not creative, I do point out that, you are always doing things with your, intellect and your, with your hands. This is what creativity is. It's not something mechanical because every process is different. But that seemed to be not something they were that interested in. Rather, whenever I broach such topic, they would go about, oh, do you see someone like us, like a mechanic, being celebrated in a popular culture, or do you see the government creating role models through people like us? In fact, we are probably given a better choice. We would be doing something else which does not shroud us in this different environment of piracy or other kind of spurious activities. But I also, like, one thing I observed in through my like decade long contact with these traders is that it also shifts. It comes in waves, so as to speak, that when a trader reaches a certain level of economic independence and is better able to manage his resources, they also have a different relationship uh, to their craft, in ways that, in a way, they were able to transcend these questions and produce a different kind of confidence, whereby there was a self-awareness, if not about their craft, but there was a self-awareness of them as an important individual who is able to philosophize and intellectualize their life, which I have noticed more in recent years, because I think through now, like, this bazaars having a hybrid existence, because a lot of the time they can make money through online, different online possibilities. There is now more conversations about kind of having done what they were supposed to do, like starting a family, building a house, having enough money to get their children to schools. So now they have more time to intellectualize, which is not with everyone, but people who are reaching a certain kind of economic confidence and mobility. So they have seen themselves grow over time from being a street vendor to getting a senior street vendor, or now having a very steady income. There's, if not a close relationship with their craft, there is now a close sense of themselves as important, or as fulfilled actor. You see, I mean, it's a slight kind of, because before they were not even like happy with themselves, so they were not even aware of, which for us, like, from from the continental philosophical tradition, but otherwise as well, we are so like everything about self-actualization and individualism. We are kind of used to saying I feel this, and I the I is so prevalent that we assumed that everybody has this reflective nature, but it wasn't there in the bazaar for the longest time. They were, as you point out, caught up in the everyday tussle of making a living. But now, with few actors, I'm seeing this, I don't know if it's a growth, but the change of kind of having more conversation with themselves that might have come from their more stable economic possibilities.
Mm. For me, that connects to some of the things you talk about in your discussion of, I'm going to say the word wrong, jugaad or frugal innovation. And one of the things you say there is that there's a sort of this kind of exoticizing discourse around that, but one that's in a way kind of like takes it out of everyday life and almost like takes it out of those everyday social struggles and sort of forms of tinkering. And I found that really valuable because in a way that strikes me as that's one of the problems about, particularly in business schools, around discussions around innovation, where innovation becomes something that happens in Silicon Valley or happens in shiny business parks rather than happening in people tinkering in garages or front living rooms. It becomes about sort of the things that happen over there rather than the sort of everyday creativity. And you're sort of bringing it back to, oh, well, look at all this here. How come that counts too, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I guess like everything has to come with the caveat, because the back of my mind I'm always, and I think that's why also I've been a bit critical about Jugaad, at least how it was projected in the management literature, that somehow like this quality ordinary people have, you know, but it's only that they have been pushed to have this ad hoc uh, uh, arrangements, because they have not been given the opportunity to experiment in other ways. But having said that, I still celebrate it. It's yes, it's come from a position of constraint, but it's still something that, if you look at the present time, it does exactly what we need in a way. One of the element, if we want to go forward with climate crisis, etc., we actually need this more custom made, thinking out of the box, doing less with more. So I would say only thing that we need now is to have a government infrastructure whereby these kind of spaces are protected, seen for what it offers, and also kind of not let that disappear. Because if this constant way of what is this new India or a new Delhi should look like, and that looks like, I think basically there's no vision about that. And I wouldn't even say that there is this kind of conspiracy to remove, or some targeted idea of removing things. There's also an amnesia and a disinterest to see how urban spaces are changing. And the fear is that because you do not uh, record that, there can be the danger that without realizing, these spaces are squeezed to an extent that we move completely from this material tinkering to again having an online kind of e-commerce vendor like existence. So that's what to realize that it's come from constraint, but it's very lot of it is celebratory and is innovation in all way of all sense of the word, because it is a conceptual as well as a physical activity, but it needs to be protected in some ways going forward. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense that you'd want to sort of, let's say, celebrate, acknowledge the creativity and innovations happening without, but also without forgetting that a lot of them are driven by, let's say, conditions of poverty or limitations. But you don't want to like sort of celebrate those. You can say this is good, but not within that. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think part of this forms of innovation and creativity you're talking about are only possible because of the ability to disregard things like IP law, patents, to basically smash together different logos, different tools and go, okay, what can we do now?
No, that's a great point, because already kind of gives me, like, if I were to, I refrain from doing that because I don't think so. I still feel sociology is not prescriptive. But if someone wants me as a practitioner and wants to me to create a toolbox of how do we preserve the good sides of Zugar and get away with or ignore the bad, one would be, yes, we do not want, because if the government intervention or some kind of institutional maneuvering happens in these places, we do not want that to come with IP sensibilities, not at all. I think the only thing that could help these places is to somehow feel a bit more seen and bit more understood in the overall urban infrastructure. Who are these people? Because I sometimes feel people do not really, it's such elite, I mean, it's almost cliche, but global cities like Delhi is such also elite understanding of what's required, like the changes, the skyline, everything. But this simple understanding that people can actually come from different parts of the country, they need time to adjust to their routine, they need a lot of hand holding in the beginning, there might be people from different class caste background, so you wouldn't immediately see them fitting into a hole, so you let these kind of spaces to exist as it is, so kind of not let them shrink in size, because that has also been happening, because you build things all around, or you also make them redundant unintentionally because you're moving the customer more to online, right? But bazaars are physical spaces, you need face-to-face consumers to come in, so those kind of, if there is a rethinking of what we can do, maybe even like more aware shopping habits, like where are we buying our things and how much are we feeding in these physical spaces. I don't think so other, in terms of trade behavior, other external intervention has to happen, because it's good as it is. As you said, there's a lot of experimentation, there's a lot of bringing of together things which are already there, and also for leftist scholars like us, it's also copy left. It's not following IP regime, and which we don't want it to change.
Cool. I'll ask a few more things, but also if people have things you want to ask, you're free to do so as well. But let me ask one more thing first. At one point you talk about sort of ways people are negotiating the relationship with sort of different tools, different technology, particularly in gaming and different items, as a kind of globalization from below, which I thought was super interesting, because again, it's talking about economic behavior coming from the Matisse, from the everyday, from the sociology, that sort of going, how is this actually structuring this world? And it reminded me a lot of the book Neoliberalism from Below by Veronica Gagejo, who's doing a kind of similar-ish kind of project, but she's doing that in Argentina, looking at sort of migrant markets there. So it'd be interesting to have these sort of different kinds of market behaviors held together and functioning not the same, but in similar fashions in different parts of the world, as they're probably negotiating a different kind of marginality. But I like this idea of approaching these sort of, let's call them big picture topics around economic flows, globalization, innovation, but saying, no, actually, here's how I actually working it in an everyday sense, and what happens if you look at it from there instead.
Yeah, there is inversion of almost everything, as I've said written in the book, from the aesthetic sense, from the use sense, from the desire sense, and it's incredible and great that you are talking about these practices, because I think it concerns more than probably about 80% of the global population, who are not buying things which are company products, but in some sense in counterfeited or in different ways co-created, or so that's there. No, that's a great book. I feel like she did a really amazing ethnography, and I couldn't really tie it to other aspects of their life as much as she could, because my access was only to the market space. So, and what I observed wasn't always so clearly neoliberal, because they were like not in production systems like where her book was located in. So, but yeah, there are a lot of parallels, and I think the biggest one being that even though a lot of the time we think about our consumer and also production systems through quite a small minority of people, because these are agenda setting people, these also are people like us, so we are all going to buy the new iPhone or the new laptop, and we assume this is the world, but then there is this huge section of people who have desires of these products, who are very aware of these products, but the way they get it or how exactly they want it, what they think is attractive, have very different concern and rationale.
Yeah, I'll ask one more thing. I'm curious about how you would approach learning from bizarre behavior in terms of to draw from it for using elsewhere without recreating the same problem. So I'm thinking about here, if we're talking about everyday comments of bazaars and sociology, drawing from that to learn from elsewhere, but without reintroducing the kind of like high modernist top-down planning. Um, and to add on to that, one thing I was really struck by, okay, when I was staying in Delhi, is I remember a few times coming to cross a road, right? And it was a road where it was like this super large road with like say like 6 or 7 layers of traffic, right? And so you had cars, you had trucks, you had the little taxi carts, you had people, you had animals. Basically, it was far too big to cross, right? And so what I would notice there is people would wait until there was sufficient quantity of people who would then all bunch together and link arms and form a mass and then collectively cross the street, because if you had enough people, the traffic stopped because it had to, right? Now, in a certain way, that strikes me as a kind of similar kind of practice where it's not a sort of critical political economy thing, but it's like people finding a way to cross the street or to do something through it in everyday life. So I'm guessing when you have those kind of practices, how do you draw from them outside of that context without letting the process of taking it out of context basically go against the whole point of what you're trying to do in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, what you say is tenacity. I think ordinary life is very tenacious and also comes together. For me, of course, like I have to like stop myself because I can get quite heady about all this. So I'm like, I have to stop myself because I still want to be rational about the possibilities. But I think cities are that. Cities are full of stimulus, and for centuries, everybody, including the flaneur and the scholar and the odd vagrant, everybody has found space to philosophize about cities, because I think it doesn't have a clear cut boundary of a monolithic life. It's about this sensory overload and visceral existence. And the only thing I would say that it's not about so much what they could do to change these places, but what essentially I would say not do, because I think nowadays what is the problem, as I was saying, is coming from the outside. So if you look at how India is thinking about the future right now in terms of any kind of, I mean, it's seen as the digital, but consumer behavior, that everything goes online in some ways without saying it clearly. But India stack and other kind of promises of digital payment and data and identity all stored in biometric digital data set, will all is tending to move towards formalized banking, and over time everybody kind of segue into online commerce. So this is what is the fear, that why do you expect a new kind of thing to come about? Okay, we cannot stop change, we have to coexist, but to let it out at such a degree and to celebrate it and to also emancipate, enable it to such a degree that you actually dislocate and dissipate what was already there. So that's where I think we have to keep thinking, because already those places of alternative existence and diversity and different sensibility exist. It's now to preserve them, or to, even not in a patronizing way, like, okay, now we make them all the poster child of New India. No, just let them be. Like, also look, if you're having a white paper about India stack, have a white paper about Bazaars as well. Why is it that there's always a white paper about a new thing, which is also okay, India is doing great with DPI, digital public infrastructure, it's does a lot of peer-to-peer, and it's incredible. I think we have that as a country to think out of the box in many ways, but somehow not having the intervention of different lives bothers me. And I think that's where we would need and somehow like only little bit of relief that the things we do is to have to platform also ideas, and these are not just spaces that are there as preserving multitude. It's a space that really is home to a very diverse group of people, and I'm really thinking where else would they replicate this kind of urban sociality and urban forms of livelihood if you don't have this face-to-face physical place whereby, I mean, the digital infrastructure is also now starting to mimic a bit of the bazaar style, because you don't only sell, company products, you have pirated, you can actually find with the dark, whatever you can find. But I think the main is this looking face to face, and this is the romantic in me, to actually gaze the emotions of, and you cannot close your eyes or scroll somewhere else. You have to listen what the other human being is feeling, what their concerns are. So it brings us very much to the human condition, and a great leveler, because I mean everybody goes in Delhi's bazaar, from the intellectual to the politician to, these are the spaces that we need to, like, even like a museum preserve, if you want, like the humans as social and also actants, and not just as some kind of tied up ancillary to corporations and big structures.
Definitely agree with that. Yeah. On that note, I'm curious if other folks have things you'd like to ask or bring into the conversation. That would be gonna pause for a second to see if there are. Maybe.
Hi, Shao.
I don't have any question, and I'm just open the camera, make it move.
Nelly.
Hi, Maitrayee. Really interesting talk. Thank you so much. I wondered, so I also gave a talk like on the co-farming communities that I have been studying in Colchester. And, some of the people that were present were very much kind of asking me, why would you expect so much of the consumer? So I was like, well, we have like, we have overconsumption, we have like kind of the world is basically falling apart in so many, ways. It's like literally burning. But people would be, like what you're telling us about kind of growing your food, like being conscious where you consume your products, and all these kind of interventions, they really put a lot of burden on us as kind of consumers. We need to kind of figure things out and then kind of step in. So I wonder whether you have like kind of any thoughts like on this side, like how can people can become more engaged, like basically with this movement and getting radicalized in their daily lives to kind of resist the lure of corporations and this myth that everything is only easy only if you use Amazon and and you only shop this way. And I mean once I got like into a really fierce kind of argument with John Kay, who is an economist, who is like, no, the world has changed. Like, I mean, basically, like we can never go back. And I actually don't agree with that as well. But I wonder whether you have like any thoughts on the basis of the bazaars and the work you've been doing.
Oh, that's
Thank
a
you.
great question, because I think that's the ultimate thing for the future, right? I mean, we are not only talking about, I think any research right now, we are constantly, because we are in a very crisis-ridden world, we also think about how does that anyways figure in making it more sustainable, better. We are even forgetting, but for continuing I am quite like militant about this. I'm like, if we live in a very complex world, why not have some kind of also reconfiguring our relationship with things. I don't agree with that convenience argument from get-go. And I would challenge, I mean, I do say like, we need to factor in, because how else would we kind of ascertain that different things exist, right? Because this is somehow not going to always be there if it's not economically sustainable, or that there is nobody engaging with it. So to an extent, I think only problem would be, for instance, someone who would say then, economically not viable, but that's why we need governments and other kind of, there are ways to, if they give so much money into making this kind of online infrastructure going, they can also put money to see that there is a income distribution, or, I mean, we can go on about that.
Yeah, can I come in here? Nellie's question is sort of what I was interested in as well, Maitrayee, listening to your work. And what I've been thinking about coming out of some of my teaching on consumerism and consumerization and neoliberalism, because, I guess one of my inclinations is to think that the emergence of the demand for the ethical consumer, right, where you're purchasing products that don't use palm oil and you're doing research into where the eggs were farmed and what the livestock's care was, and all of these kind of these amplifying demands for ethical consumerism emerge only from the lack of regulations consequent of neoliberalization, right? So that because of international trade and deforestation in Brazil and how that's been allowed to happen, right? There's all these knock-on effects that, for a reduced price for the consumer. And then the demand then becomes about the consumer managing what is ultimately, to my mind, I guess, should be an economic state managerial question, right? Like I guess I've started to think about it as a shifting of labor from what should have been the labor of the government to a kind of a educational process on the consumer. So while I sort of agree the point, right? Like we should care more for the ways in which we consume. I'm also like sort of unwilling to yield the idea that it should be our responsibility in the first place. That's what I'm thinking in relation to the conversation that's happening. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I don't think so. It's unto the consumer to bear the burden of what the possibilities can be. But it's also to somehow like to realize that there are certain practices which is in society that can be actually, we are part of it, right? So in what ways can we ascertain that we do our bits to make this continue? Because especially like if it is something with interface, like co-farming or bazaars, where you need actors to come together. So it's not just an economic transactional side. It is about also seeing this life form and what it means for societies to go ahead, and what it means for humanity to be part of these kind of diverse spaces. But I agree with you completely. And that's what I've been saying. It's for everything that we feel guilty about. I think we shouldn't feel guilty about in the first place that it's not us the burden of the planet. I mean, we have representative, we have elected governments, we have a lot of tons of resources which at a higher level can go towards distribution. But in a way, now what is happening, I almost feel that people are so frustrated that one is putting everything together. So you can have frustration with way things are, but at the same time preserve and also align your politics with things which you think has the potential, because the frustration and the lack of engagement, because you are just it also can lead to an isolation, and that would be sad. So yeah. I don't know, hope like if we make this different, like co-farming, and there's so many interesting things happening, if we keep bringing them to light, and in a way the government are pushed in a way to see this as an essential feature of our life, not something that could be done away with. So that's how I see more the engagement, not as it's our burden. No, it's not. completely not. We do not have the resource. We do not have anything. We are all laden to our salaries. Forget about like if we start doing that, we would be penniless in few days. So I don't know who gets helped in that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. No, I mean, I agree the characterization. It's a difficult, right, balancing act almost, but I'm brought to think that there's some important shift that happens when you're thinking not in terms of responsibility, which is how I often think ethical consumerism is presented, but in terms of resistance, right? Like that, and that's the kind of framework through which you're thinking is like that certain arrangements of production and consumption can provide alternative economies or sites of resistance rather than, a kind of demand for responsibility.
Yeah, and I think our everyday interaction is like that. We do not go to a place with our ideologies. We go because it matters to us. It somehow makes our life more textured, right? We don't want to be, at least I feel like none of us would want to be just with our phone all day. We go out, we have our walks, we interact. So yeah, I know where it is. Yes, as a responsibility, as some kind of like higher moral fiber that becomes a bit tedious and problematic as well. Yeah. Thank you so much for all the good questions.
If I can jump in on that, for unfortunately for my sins, I had to teach business ethics for 10 years. So I had to spend a lot of time talking about ethical consumerism. And I would totally agree with the characterization that in the present, ethical consumerism is a kind of privatization of regulation. But I think it's interesting to think about, it didn't start that way. A lot of it started is because it's people having concerns about let's say labor standards or production standards and saying, okay, well, how can I root that and embed that in my everyday life rather than it being some sort of abstract thing? So what starts as an attempt to live in everyday politics then becomes turned into a kind of individualized form of regulation. And that's kind of an interesting shift from being a sort of, I guess you'd say, what started as maybe a resistance practice then became a sort of regulatory practice.
Yeah, I feel like this is my last, like, I hate when I'm talking like I know everything, which I don't, but I feel like if we give like more credence to just the rhythms of our bodies and our life, we would do much better, because I feel like often on we hold back, and then we have like some kind of spokesperson for this movement and that movement, and it gets shrouded in this kind of, as you say, more stricter way of being, like this kind of silos. But actually we are all stakeholders in every part of the society, apart from the harmful elements. And as scholars, we are lucky to kind of build that rigor by which we can identify where a particular process goes wrong and which needs to be somehow helped and propagated. So in that ways, I feel we all can keep the diversity alive with selective, intervention.
Cool. Well, that was a nice sort of segue to not finish, but let's pause there. And well, thank you very much for coming along, and thanks for all the interesting questions and discussion.
Thank you, Stephen, so much. Yes, and thank you for all the questions. We have a lot of conversations to carry on this. Thank you so much.